In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And 43 days that nobody at the administratum has a box on the form for. The defense of a forgotten world alongside Ork Freebooters against an enemy that wore brass on every surface, with allies who thought the screaming was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. He'll start with the part nobody prepared them for, which wasn't the killing or the dying, it was the laughing. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story comes from a line infantryman of the Thesmar 19th, whose entire education in Xenos combat doctrine was one briefing read off a pamphlet printed under the previous sector governor. Savage, undisciplined, technologically inferior, destroy on sight. Every one of those claims was wrong in a way that nearly killed him. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin. The arrangement lasted 43 days. I will tell you about every one of them, or every one I remember, which is not the same number. 43 days of fighting alongside Ork Freebooters in the defense of a world the Imperium had already forgotten about, against an enemy that wore brass on every surface and screamed things I am not going to repeat, with allies who thought the screaming was the funniest thing they had ever heard. I have been asked to explain what that was like and told to be thorough. The liaison from the administratum has his stylus ready, and an expression I have seen before on men handed a form with no correct box on it. So I will start with the part nobody prepared us for, which was not the killing or the dying. It was the laughing. Orcs laugh constantly. They laugh when they fight. They laugh when they eat. They laugh when one of their own gets his arm torn off, and the one who lost the arm laughs the hardest because now he gets to go see the doc, and the doc has a bag of other arms he has been collecting, and the whole process of choosing a replacement arm is apparently one of the great comedic experiences of Orc civilization. I did not know any of this before Karsfeld. I did not know most of what I know now. I was a line infantryman in the Thesmar 19th, and my education in the subject of Xenos combat doctrine had consisted of a single briefing delivered by a junior officer who had never seen a greenskin and was reading from a pamphlet that had been printed by the date stamp on its cover during the previous administration of the sector governor. That pamphlet told me that orcs were savage, undisciplined, technologically inferior, and to be destroyed on sight. Every one of those claims was wrong in a way that nearly killed me. Karsfeld is a civilized world. That is the official classification. An established population, functional infrastructure, a tithe grade somebody was still filing, and at least one city large enough to have its own administratum annex. When we arrived, it had all of those. By the time the arrangement started, it had most of them. The city was Branhurst, and it sat in a river basin between two ranges of hills mined for aggregate since before anyone could remember. Low and bald and covered in quarry roads that switchbacked up slopes of pale stone. The whole landscape stripped and exhausted, like something used until it stopped being useful and nobody had bothered to stop. The population was somewhere around 300,000, most of them crammed into Branhurst proper, living in hab blocks that backed up against the southern hills. They had been there for the entire invasion. Nobody had evacuated them because there was nowhere to evacuate them to and no transport to do it with. And so they lived behind our trench line, 300,000 people whose survival depended on 600 soldiers they had never met, holding a line they could not see. We could hear the city at night sometimes when the wind came from the south. Generators. A distant hum of people existing. It was easy to forget they were there. It was important not to. We landed at the starport, which was a field, and marched 9 kilometers along a rubble road to the Haldren Line, which was the defensive perimeter that 3 regiments and the Planetary Defense Force had built across the northern approach to Branhurst during the first months of the invasion. We were 3,700 when we came down. We had been 3,860 when we were loaded. The crossing took 11 weeks, and the difference was written off against the passage, which is how it is done. The Navy counts what it loads, and the Munitorum counts what it unloads, and nobody is required to explain the gap. I did not think about those 160 men again until much later, when I had learned what a number written off against something actually means. By the time we arrived, one of those 3 regiments had been destroyed, a second had been rendered combat ineffective, and the third was the Karsfeld 16th Provincial, which had held the western section for 211 days and looked it. They pulled off the line the week before we arrived, combat ineffective, folded into the Branhurst garrison to hold the city perimeter. We inherited their section along with our own. We were the reinforcement, all 3,700 of us. Within 6 weeks, we were 640. That is not a miscount. That is not a rounding error. 3,060 soldiers of the Thesmar 19th died in 6 weeks on the Haldren Line, and I will tell you exactly how, because it matters. They died because the enemy came at us every day, sometimes twice, sometimes 3 times, and every assault was the same. Red armor, brass trim, chain axes and combat blades and things that had been weapons once and were now just heavy pieces of metal with edges. They came screaming, always, without cover, without suppressing fire, without any tactical approach that I was trained to recognize. They just ran at us across open ground, hundreds at a time, and our last fire cut them down in rows, and the rows behind climbed over the rows in front, and the rows behind those climbed over those, and eventually they hit the trench, and then it was hand to hand, and that was where we lost everyone. Because they were not just cultists. Mixed in with the mortals, spread through the charge like stones in a handful of grain, were the ones in power armor. Renegade Astartes, traitor Marines. Venthen's field estimate put their number at somewhere between 50 and 80. It did not matter whether the number was 50 or 5. A lasgun does not stop a traitor Marine. A lasgun fired at the chest plate of a renegade in full war plate does approximately nothing. I saw men empty entire power cells into a single charging figure, and the figure did not slow down and did not change direction, and killed the man who was shooting, and killed the 2 men beside him, and moved on to the next firing position and killed everyone there too. The officers we captured in the first week, before we stopped taking prisoners because they bit through their own restraints and attacked the Medici staff, told us nothing useful except one thing. Their leader wore a helm with horns. They said the horns were made from the weapons of champions he had killed, reforged, and mounted on the faceplate, and that he had been fighting for longer than any of them could count. They spoke about him the way you speak about weather. He was not a commander to them. He was a condition. And the condition had been applied to Karsfeld and would continue to be applied until there was nothing left to kill, or until somebody killed him first. And nobody had managed the second option in however many centuries he had been doing this. What the prisoners never thought to tell us was what the war band wanted. Twice in the first 6 weeks they broke the line. Not nearly. Broke it, opened it, stood in it. Both times they killed everyone in the breach and went back the way they had come. A force that wanted Branhurst had 2 chances to walk into Branhurst and took neither. They were not besieging the city. They were keeping it. A city with a line in front of it produces soldiers who have to come and stand on that line, and soldiers on a line can be killed there indefinitely. Break through and the fighting stops. So they came every day and killed what we sent and went home to their quarry, and the Munitorum kept sending, and the whole thing would have run until the sector ran out of regiments. The regiment's confessor had been killed in the 3rd week. Nobody replaced him. Nobody asked. For a while, the sergeants said the words over the dead themselves, badly, out of memory. And then the dead came faster than the words could be said, and we stopped saying them at all. I do not know when exactly. It was not a decision. It was a thing that stopped happening. We reported this. We filed engagement reports. We sent requests for heavy weapons, armor support, air cover, reinforcement. The Munitorum responded with the speed and precision for which it is universally admired. Over 11 days, we received 14 crates of las guns, 6 of las carbines, a pallet of entrenching tools, 2,000 mess kits, and a consignment of winter clothing intended for a regiment on a different planet. We did not receive a single las cannon. We did not receive a single missile launcher. We did not receive armor. We did not receive troops. We received at one point a crate that contained nothing but 4,000 unit shoulder patches for the Thesmar 19th, which was a supply request that had been filed during our founding muster 2 years earlier and had only now been fulfilled. I handed them out to the 600 survivors. Every man got 6. Some used the spares to patch holes in their uniforms. Most burned them for warmth. What we did have, by accident rather than design, was the equipment left behind by the dead. Not our dead. The other regiments. When a regiment dies on the line, its equipment does not evaporate. It stays where it was when the last man fell, and if somebody walks over and picks it up, they have equipment. We had walked over. So the Thesmar 19th, 640 men holding a trench line built for a full regiment, was sitting on the combined arms inventory of 2.5 Imperial Guard regiments. We had less cannons, we had autocannons, we had missile launchers, mortars, 3 Chimera chassis with working turrets but dead engines, and an amount of small arms that was frankly embarrassing for a unit our size. What we did not have was people to fire them. I had personally inventoried 11 heavy weapons platforms that were sitting in storage alcoves along the trench line with their ammunition stacked beside them and their crew dead and nobody to replace them. We had enough firepower to hold the Haldren line against a standard infantry assault for months, against a force that included traitor Astartes and did not care about casualties and came at us every single day. We had about 3 weeks before the maths killed us. Our colonel, Harsk Venthen, did the calculation on the 9th day after our complement dropped below 700. He did it on a piece of card torn from an ammunition crate with a stylus in front of his surviving company commanders, and the number he arrived at was 22. 22 days. That was how long we could sustain the current rate of engagement before we dropped below the minimum effective strength required to cover the section we had been assigned. After that, the line would break, the enemy would pour through into Branhurst, and the civilian population would experience what happens when a devotional war band dedicated to blood and brass arrives in a city that has nowhere to run. He showed the card to Commissar Sorek, who looked at it and handed it back without comment. Then Venthen asked the question that would have got any of us shot if we had asked it first. He asked whether anyone present had a contact outside standard Imperial channels who could source additional combatants in exchange for surplus materiel. He did not say mercenaries. He did not say Xenos. He asked the question the way a man asks whether anyone knows where to find ration supplements when the supply chain has broken, which is to say carefully and without using any of the words that would make the answer a capital offense. There were 8 people in that briefing room, counting the commissar, and for about 6 seconds nobody said anything. Then Captain Tessavine, who had been our logistics officer before the logistics staff was killed, and who had been running the company ever since on the principle that if you can manage a supply column, you can manage a rifle platoon, said that she had spoken with a rogue trader named C.L. Dravek, who had been running cargo in and out of the Karsfeld system since before the invasion, and who had, in Tessavine's words, a standing relationship with certain non-imperial military elements. The colonel asked what kind of elements. Tessavine said orcs. Nobody spoke. Commissar Sorek looked at the card with the number 22 on it. He looked at the trench map on the wall. He looked at Tessavine, he said, and I was told this afterward because I was not in the room, that he had not heard any of this conversation, and that if it continued, he would still not hear it, and that if any arrangement were to be reached, he would require it to be concluded before the next scheduled engagement report was filed, so that the report could truthfully state that no contact with Xenos forces had occurred as of the time of writing. That was the closest thing to permission. Tessavine left the briefing and was gone for 2 days. I learned about the arrangement the way line soldiers learn everything, which is that somebody told somebody who told my sergeant, Devin Hulk, who told me to make sure every weapon in the secondary alcoves was cleaned, charged, and laid out in rows. I asked what for. He said we were expecting guests, and when I asked what kind, he said the kind that are 8 feet tall and green. I stared at him. He stared back. He was not smiling. "Emperor, help us," he said, and he said it the way men say it when they have stopped meaning anything by it, the way you say a word you have said 10,000 times. Hulk had been with the 19th since before I joined and had exactly one facial expression, which was that of a man given a job he considers idiotic and intends to complete, to standard anyway. The colonel had made a decision, and our opinions were not part of the arrangement. We had 20 days of combat effectiveness left, and if I had a better idea, I should submit it through proper channels and wait 8 to 12 months. I did not have a better idea. Nobody did. So I cleaned the weapons and laid them out and waited for the guests to arrive. The answer came on the 3rd day. Not from orbit. They had been in system already, which was the first thing I learned about freebooters that the pamphlet had not covered. They do not arrive. They are already there, in the spaces between Imperial shipping lanes like rust in a hull seam, and when you need them, you do not summon them so much as acknowledge that they were watching the whole time. Dravek put the offer through channels I was not briefed on, and the response came within a day, which Tessavine told us later was unusually fast and should have been a warning. The terms, as I had them from Hulk, who had them from the captain, who had them from the colonel, who had them from Dravek, who had them from the Orks, were as follows. The Ork warband, under the command of a captain called Dregmar, would provide combat support to the Thesmar 19th for as long as the fighting lasted. In exchange, they would receive unrestricted access to the surplus weapons inventory, the right to loot any enemy equipment recovered during engagements, and first selection of any vehicles captured or salvaged during the campaign. Additionally, and this was the part that made Hulk close his eyes for about 3 seconds when he explained it, the Orks had stipulated that they expected the fighting to be, in the rogue trader's translation, good. Not adequate, not acceptable, good, meaning frequent, violent, and involving opponents who would fight back. If the fighting was not good, the arrangement would be terminated and the Orks would leave, taking everything they had been given and everything they could carry. If the fighting was good, they would stay. That was the contract. There was nothing written down. Dravek told us afterwards that she had opened by offering payment and had been asked how many teeth we had, teeth being Ork currency and Ork currency being Ork teeth, and that when she explained we had none of those, she had been asked, without any apparent unkindness, what we thought we were for. The guns were her idea, She said it saved a great deal of time. They arrived at dawn on what I will call day 1, though the days before it had their own numbers and their own dead. They came overland from the east in vehicles that conformed to no design philosophy I had met in 12 years of service. Large, loud. Several appeared to be built out of other vehicles taken apart and reassembled by somebody who understood the concept and disagreed with the usual approach. One had tracks on the left side and wheels on the right. One had a turret mounted backwards, and no one on the crew seemed to consider this a problem. They came in a herd. The noise preceded them by about 2 kilometers, and several men on the forward observation posts reported an armored assault before the silhouettes resolved through the dust, and the general sense of panic was replaced by a different and more specific kind of dread. I was standing on the fire step when the first vehicle stopped at the wire. The wire was razor coil, 3 bands deep, staked across the approach to our section. The vehicle, which was something between a half-track and a fortress, and an accident, ground to a halt about 10 meters from the first band and sat there idling with a sound like a sick turbine. A hatch opened on the top. An orc stood up. He was enormous. Not figuratively. From the base of the hatch to the top of his skull, he was about 1.5 meters of visible mass, which meant the part still inside the vehicle was at least as much again. His skin was dark green, the color of old moss on a wet wall. His jaw was metal, not partly. The entire lower half of his face had been replaced with an augmetic made of what looked like ship's hull plate, bolted to the bone at 4 points, rivets the size of my thumbnail. His eyes moved from the wire to the trench to the 600 men of the Thesmar 19th, staring back at him from behind sandbags and firing platforms. He opened his metal jaw and said something in a voice that I felt in my sternum. I did not speak Orcish. I did not need to. The tone was unmistakable. It was the tone of a customer arriving at a shop he has heard good things about and finding it smaller than expected. He was not impressed. He was willing to be convinced. Captain Dregmaw. That was his name, or the closest human phonetics could get to it. The rogue trader, Dravek, translated his first words for us. She stood on the parapet between our trench line and the orc vehicles, which took a kind of courage I am not equipped to evaluate, and she relayed the captain's assessment of our position, our equipment, and our tactical situation. The assessment was 3 sentences long, and she gave it to us without softening any of it. The trench was too clean. That meant we had not been fighting properly. We had nice guns, and he could see why we needed help, because plainly we did not know what they were for. Then the third put to nobody in particular. Where were the enemies, and could he start now? Colonel Venthen came out to meet him. He walked up to a creature twice his height and 4 times his weight, carrying what appeared to be a naval boarding axe welded to an engine block, and put out his hand the way he would to any Allied commander at a joint briefing. Dregmaw looked at the hand. He looked at Venthen. He reached down and shook it, and I heard the colonel's knuckles crack from 20 meters away, and Venthen did not flinch, and Dregmaw made a sound that I would later learn was approval. It was a grunt. It sounded like a generator starting. Then the captain bellowed an order, and 70-odd Ork Freebooterz poured out of the column into our trench line like water into a drain. And that was the last moment of order we had for 43 days. The numbers mattered more than anything else in this story. We were 640. The orcs were, at initial count, 73. And counting orcs is like counting a bar fight, and the number changes depending on when you look and who is currently unconscious. 73 was what Tessavine recorded in the first hour, and it was probably wrong by the time she finished writing it because 2 fistfights broke out during the disembarkation, and one combatant was rendered temporarily inoperative by having a vehicle door slammed on his head, apparently as the punchline to a joke I did not hear. We faced an enemy force we estimated at between 4,000 and 5,000, including the renegade Marines, whose exact number nobody wanted to calculate because the answer would not improve morale. Our combined strength, human and Xenos, was just over 700. The enemy outnumbered us roughly 6-1. Adding 70 orcs to 600 guardsmen sounds like a marginal improvement. It was not. They did not add to our strength. They multiplied it by being so completely different from anything in my experience that the enemy had no framework for dealing with them. Those first 24 hours were not about fighting. They were about coexistence, which no training doctrine in the Imperium covers. The Haldren line had been built to Imperial field engineering standard, firing steps at chest height, communication trenches wide enough for 2 men to pass, overhead cover at standard clearance. None of it worked for orcs. The firing steps were too low, and the communication trenches were too narrow. The overhead cover sat at the exact height to crack an orc across the forehead every time he stood up, which happened constantly, because orcs do not crouch as a matter of principle. They did not store ammunition so much as carry it on their persons in quantities that made them, individually, a munitions hazard. Within 3 hours, 2 sections of trench wall had been knocked down by orcs, walking through them. A firing platform had collapsed under an orc who wanted a better view, and a fistfight over sleeping arrangements had widened 4 meters of communication trench by about 2 feet through the simple application of an orc back to the revetment. Hulk watched from the command dugout with his one expression and said nothing. He had been told to make it work and did not have time to also have feelings about it. Venthan gave the orcs a 400-meter section of the line, the one adjacent to ours. He wanted them beside us, close enough to support, far enough to maintain what he called operational separation, which was a military term for keeping them where they could not steal anything that was bolted down. This did not work. Orcs do not respect operational separation. They do not respect property lines, ammunition allocations, designated sleeping areas, latrines, or any form of boundary that is not enforced by something large enough to physically stop them. Within the first day, 3 orc boys had wandered into our section, found the weapon storage alcoves, and begun what I can only describe as shopping. They picked up las guns, examined them, made disparaging noises, put them down. They picked up an autocannon, examined it, made appreciative noises, and walked away with it. A trooper named Bracken tried to stop one of them, and the orc looked at him the way you might look at a child, pulling on your sleeve, and kept walking. Bracken looked at me. I told him to let it go. The orc had the autocannon over one shoulder like a hunting rifle, and he was already modifying it as he walked, which is to say he was hitting it with a wrench, and it was somehow getting louder. The mech boy was called Grizguts, or the closest I could get to pronouncing it, and he was the reason the arrangement worked at all, militarily speaking, and also the reason for most of the property damage. A mech boy does not study a machine or follow a schematic. He looks at it, he knows what it should do, and he hits it until it does that thing, and it works. Grizguts looked at our 3 dead chimeras on the first afternoon. He walked around them. He kicked one. He hit another one with a wrench the size of my forearm. He opened the engine compartment of the third, stared at it, reached in with both hands, pulled out a fistful of components, put them back in a different order, kicked the hull plate, and the engine started. It had been dead for 4 months. The tech adepts attached to the 16th had declared it beyond repair before they were killed in the same assault that broke the regiment. Grizguts fixed it in 9 minutes, by rearranging its engine in a way that should not have worked and hitting it. He then immediately spray-painted a grinning face on the front armor in red pigment that he produced from somewhere I did not see and did not ask about. And I stood there with my mouth open while a dead vehicle drove itself in a circle with no one at the controls, because apparently that was also part of the repair. Then he turned and looked at me. Not at the vehicle, at me. I had no Orcish, and he had no Gothic, so I pointed at the Chimera and nodded. He made a noise from somewhere below his ribs, hit the hull once more with the flat of the wrench, and went to find something else that was broken. After that, he showed me things. Every few days, he would appear at the boundary line holding some object he had made, and he would hold it up and wait, and I would nod, and he would take it away satisfied. I never once knew what any of them did. By the end of day 1, the Orcs had claimed their section, customized it in ways that made the engineering officer physically ill, armed themselves from our surplus inventory, painted approximately 40% of all available surfaces, either red or with crude pictograms of faces, and eaten something that may or may not have been from our ration supply, but that I decided not to investigate. The 73 were not the whole of it. They had brought grots, perhaps 2 for every Orc, and nobody counted them. Grots dig. Grots carry. Grots go out at night onto ground. 600 trained soldiers would not cross and come back dragging things. And about a third of what they dragged back was food, in a sense I did not want defined. They stripped the dead. Both sides of the dead. Within a week they had a fungus bed going in the collapsed end of a communication trench, and within 2 weeks our own men had stopped remarking on it. The Munitorum's failure to supply us was never a problem the Orcs had. The trench smelled different. The trench sounded different. There was a constant low-level noise from the Orc section that was partly mechanical, partly biological, and partly a kind of ambient aggression that had no source I could point at. Orcs are never quiet. Even when they sleep, if they sleep, the section buzzed and clanked and occasionally erupted in short bursts of violence that resolved themselves before anyone could respond. I lay on the firing step that first night and listened to the alien noise of our new allies, and I thought very clearly and without any doubt, we have made a terrible mistake. And then the enemy came at dawn and I changed my mind. Day 2 opened with the standard pattern. The enemy emerged from their positions in the hills north of the line, formed into a loose mass, and charged. They came screaming. They always came screaming. That sound, that raw-throated sustained shriek, that was not a battle cry and not a war chant, but something older and worse, something that came from a place inside a human being that is not supposed to have a voice. The mortals came first, hundreds of them, stripped to the waist or wearing fragments of armor, daubed with symbols I was trained to look away from. Behind them, in the second wave, the renegade Marines. We had the routine by now. We had been doing this for 6 weeks. Volley fire from the firing step, sustained, targeting the front rank, heavy weapons on the armored targets. Fall back to the second line when they hit the wire, bayonets when they reach the trench, die when the Marines arrive. That was the routine. That was the calculation that gave us 22 days. The Orcs did not follow the routine. The Orcs did not know there was a routine. What happened was this. The enemy charge began. The Guard section opened fire according to drill. Disciplined, controlled, effective. In the Orc section, 400 meters to our right, nothing happened for about 15 seconds. The Orcs watched the charge come in. They watched it the way spectators watch a race, with a kind of anticipatory attention that I had never seen in a combat situation. Dregmaw was standing on the parapet in full view, which would have got any of us killed by a sniper within seconds, but which did not seem to concern him, and he was watching the enemy approach with something close to professional interest. He was evaluating the charge. He was assessing its quality. Then, when the leading edge of the enemy mass was about 300 meters out, he opened his metal jaw and roared one word that I heard from 400 meters away. Dravek told me later it was the word for now, and that Ork has only the one, and that it does the work of a whole order. Every Ork in the section went over the top at once. 70 Orks climbed out of the trench and charged the charging enemy. Not to the firing step, not to a forward position. Out of the trench entirely, onto open ground, directly into the path of a massed infantry assault at a full sprint. They were screaming, too. Their scream was different from the enemy's scream. The enemy's scream was devotional. It was an offering. The Ork scream was possessive. It was the sound of something claiming the fight as its property. And they hit the enemy charge head-on, about 200 meters in front of our lines, and the noise that came out of that collision was like nothing I have heard before or since. It was wet and metallic and enormous, and it contained, under all the rest of it, laughter. The Orks were laughing. They hit a wall of screaming berserkers and blood-mad cultists, and they laughed, because this was what they had been promised, and the promise had been kept. The fighting was good. I stood on the firing step and watched an Ork knob I did not yet know was called Gutbrak pick up a cultist by the leg and use him as a weapon against 2 other cultists. I watched Dregmaw meet a renegade marine mid-charge, and the impact stop both of them dead, like 2 vehicles colliding. And then Dregmaw hit him with the boarding axis engine block, and the marine went sideways and did not get up. I watched an Ork boy take a chain axe to the shoulder that would have cut a man in half. Look down at the wound, look at the cultist who had dealt it, and headbutt him hard enough to cave the helmet in. He went on fighting with the chain axe still in his shoulder, because removing it would have meant stopping. The enemy charge broke, not slowly, not by attrition, not by the grinding calculus of firepower that I had been trained to expect. It broke because the enemy, for the first time in 6 weeks, had met something in the open ground between the lines that was as violent as they were and considerably larger, and they did not know what to do about it. Some of them kept fighting. The renegade Marines kept fighting, because I do not think they were capable of doing anything else. But the mortal cultists, the bulk of the assault force, faltered. They hesitated. And hesitation on a battlefield is death. And the Orks knew that better than anyone and exploited it with a joy that was genuinely horrible to watch. The battle lasted 40 minutes. 30 of those were the Orks chasing retreating cultists across open ground, catching them, and killing them by methods that suggest a richer imaginative life than Imperial xenological assessments acknowledge. When it was over, the Orks came back. They climbed into the trench, dropping over the parapet like returning workers, carrying trophies and weapons and, in one case, an entire enemy banner that an Ork boy had ripped off its pole and was wearing as a cloak. They were bleeding from dozens of wounds. None of them seemed to notice. Dregmaw found Colonel Venthen and said something through Dravek that translated roughly as, "That was acceptable. Is there more?" Venthen said there would be more tomorrow. Dregmaw made the approval grunt. Then the Orks sat down and began eating and arguing about who had killed the most enemies, and the argument escalated into a fistfight, and the fistfight was apparently also part of the after-action process. We lost no one. For the first time in 6 weeks of daily assaults, the Thesma 19th took 0 casualties. I checked the figures 3 times. Hulk checked them twice. We sent the engagement report up the chain, and I imagine whoever read it checked as well, assuming anyone read it, which our resupply situation did not encourage me to bet on. The orcs had taken the entire assault on themselves, in the open, by choice, and broken it. 11 orcs were wounded, some of them badly enough that a human would have been evacuated to a Mediki facility and probably written off the active roster. The orcs went to their doc, a creature called Grachoppa, whose medical equipment consisted of a hacksaw, a welding torch, a bag of mismatched body parts, and an enthusiasm for surgery that bordered on the recreational. He worked with a grot, sitting on his shoulder holding the lamp, and when the grot let the light wander, he hit it, and the grot climbed back up and held the lamp better, and neither of them appeared to regard this as a difficulty in the working relationship. By nightfall, every one of the 11 was back on the line. One of them had a different arm than the one he had started the day with. He seemed pleased about this. The arm was bigger. That was day 2. By day 5, a shape had established itself. The enemy attacked. The orcs countercharged. The guard fired support from the trench line, while the orcs fought in the open. The enemy retreated. The orcs came back. The orcs argued. The orcs ate. The orcs modified something. The enemy attacked again. Orcs cared about 3 things in order: fighting, loot, noise. Everything else, including planning, hygiene, the structural integrity of defensive positions, and the continued survival of their human allies, was somewhere below those 3. It was not that they wanted us dead. It was that whether we lived or died was about as relevant to their decision-making as the weather. I got to know Gutbrak because he was the knob holding the section of trench line closest to ours. A knob is an orc of authority, somewhere between a sergeant and a local warlord. He stood about 7.5 feet, which is average, and carried a shooter in one hand and a cleaver the size of a dining table in the other, and wore a coat of salvaged flak panels stitched together with what I eventually realized was wire off our own communication lines. He had taken it on day 3. I reported the theft to Hulk, and Hulk looked at me with his one expression and said if I wanted the wire back, I was welcome to go and ask. I did not go and ask. Gutbrak outweighed me by a factor I did not want to calculate, and his response to requests he did not like was to hit things, and the nearest thing was usually the person making the request. On day 6, that stopped being a figure of speech. A trooper from 2nd Company called Weatherly stood in a communication trench and would not move aside for a boy carrying a length of girder, and the boy hit him with the girder, and Weatherly died where he fell without finishing the sentence he had started. Nobody involved understood that anything had occurred. The boy stepped over him and carried on with the girder. We took Weatherly out and put him with the others, and Venthin recorded him as killed on active service, which was true in every sense that the form required. There was no inquiry because there was nobody to hold one against. There was no compensation because there was no currency in which the debt could be expressed. There was no apology because the concept does not exist in the language. Weatherly was not murdered. Weatherly was in the way. Orcs are transactional. Every interaction is an exchange. You give something, you get something. If you give nothing, you get nothing, and also possibly you get hit. I discovered this on day 4 when I brought Gutbrak 3 Lasker binds from the surplus inventory, personally, without being asked, and placed them on the ground in front of him. He looked at them. He looked at me. He picked one up and examined it and made the disapproving noise that orcs make when something is too small, too clean, or insufficiently loud. Dravek was 30 meters away and gave it to me later without being asked. Too quiet, and I would bring him a proper one. Then he put it down and looked at me again. Then he said something to one of his boys, and the boy went away and came back with a piece of metal that turned out to be a section of enemy armor plate, about a foot square, taken from a renegade marine's pauldron. Gutbrack handed it to me. I gave him weapons. He gave me a trophy. After that, Gutbrack remembered my face, which is a significant achievement for an orc. I was the one who brought guns. I had a function. I existed. This became my role. Nobody assigned it. I became the man who worked the boundary between our section and theirs, carrying surplus equipment across and bringing back whatever the orcs chose to give in return, which was usually trophies, broken enemy weapons, or in one memorable case, a live grenade that Gutbrack thought was funny, and which I disposed of with as much dignity as a man can manage while sprinting. Hulk called me the liaison. Tessavine called me essential. The troops called me something less complimentary that I will not repeat. I did not care. The arrangement was working, and it was keeping us alive, and somebody had to stand at the junction point and make sure it kept working. That somebody was me, because I had volunteered through the act of not running away fast enough when Gutbrack first pointed at me and grunted. That is what I told people. 6 weeks on the Haldren line watching men I knew get taken apart by things a lost gun could not stop, and nothing to do about any of it. Carrying guns across a boundary line was the first job on that planet where the doing of it changed the outcome. Not brave, not curious. It was the one task available to a corporal that was not standing in a hole waiting. What that work consisted of, day to day, was mostly standing about. An orc will not be hurried and will not be queued, and about a third of my crossings ended with me waiting 40 minutes at the boundary line holding 3 last guns while Gutbrack finished an argument. I learned perhaps 9 words of Orcish in 6 weeks, and they learned none of ours, and it did not matter, because anything that had to be said could be said with an object held up and a nod, or the absence of one. I learned which noise meant too small, which meant too clean, and which meant that whatever I had brought was going to be modified before use, and I should not be standing near it. Grizguts improved a last gun for me on day 19. I had not asked. I had put it down while I moved a crate, and when I turned around he had it open, and there was nothing to be done except watch. He gave it back 9 minutes later. It was heavier. The barrel had gained a collar of welded plate, and it now made a noise on discharge that carried across the section and through a beam twice the width. It also worked. I fired it 3 weeks and it never failed once, which is more than I can say for the one the Munitorum issued me. I gave it up eventually and not willingly, and I will come to why. They took an interest in our dead, not the way you are thinking. Grots strip bodies and do not distinguish, and on the 3rd day I found 2 going through a row of our own casualties laid out for burial, and took hold of one by the collar of whatever it was wearing. Gutbrack arrived while I was still deciding what I intended to do next. He listened to Dravek explain the problem, looked at the row of bodies, looked at me, and said something short. From then on, the Grots left our dead alone, and I never learned whether that was an order, a boundary, or a favor, and I have never worked out whether the orcs understood what they had agreed to, or simply understood that I wanted it. And every second evening or so, the orc section fought itself. Not seriously. 2 boys would disagree about ownership of something and go at each other, and within a minute there would be a ring of 40 greenskins around them, roaring, and within 2 there would be guardsmen at the parapet watching. We took bets. 600 men of the Thesmar 19th stood on a firing step in the evenings and wagered ration credit on which orc would still be standing. Hulk did not stop it. Sorek walked past it twice and said nothing. It was the only entertainment on that planet, and by the third week, the men had favorites. By day 8, the enemy had changed tactics. They had been charging us across open ground, and the orcs had been meeting those charges and breaking them, and the enemy, whoever was directing them behind the screaming and the devotional frenzy, had noticed that this was not working. The charges stopped. For 2 days, nothing. No assault, no probing attack, no contact. The guard section used this time to rest, repair, reinforce positions. The orcs used this time to become increasingly agitated. Orcs without a fight are a problem. They are not designed for inactivity. They are not equipped for patience. By the end of the first day without combat, 3 separate fights had broken out inside the orc section, one of which resulted in a boy being thrown bodily out of the trench and landing on the wire, which he then got tangled in and had to be cut free by Grizguts, using a tool that also appeared to function as a musical instrument. By the end of the second day, Dregmaw himself had to break up a brawl that was threatening to collapse a section of trench wall, and he broke it up by the straightforward method of hitting every participant until they stopped, which took about 30 seconds and left 4 orcs flat on their backs, looking at the sky with expressions that in a human you would call reflective, but in an orc probably meant their brains were rebooting. On day 10, the enemy came back and did not charge. They came at night in small groups through the rubble fields east of our section, and they hit the guard positions, not the orc positions. Somebody on the other side had worked out that the orcs were the teeth, and we were the jaw, and that teeth without a jaw are loose objects. The night assault killed 11 of my people before we drove it back, more than the previous 8 days combined. They came fast, quiet by their standards, into a section of trench thinly manned, because the company covering it had sent a fire team to deal with an orc dispute over sleeping arrangements, and in that gap, they came through the wire and killed everyone in the forward bay. Bracken was in the forward bay, the same trooper who had tried to stop an orc from walking off with an autocannon on day 1, who had looked at me expecting me to do something and who I had told to let it go. The orc had not killed him. The orc had not even noticed him, but the orc had taken the autocannon that would have been covering that bay, and without it, the bay had nothing that could stop a marine in power armor, and Bracken and 10 others died in the dark with their lost guns firing and their beams sliding off ceramite. They did it with blades. They were fast and they were strong, and 3 of them were in power armor, and by the time I reached the bay with Hulk and a squad of riflemen, there were bodies on the duckboards and blood on the sandbags, and the enemy was gone, back into the dark, and we could hear them out there making sounds that were not quite words. One of the men in my squad, a boy called Olivane, who had been with us 4 weeks, started saying the litany for the dead over Bracken and got about 6 words into it before he stopped, because he did not know the rest, and there was nobody left to ask. He looked at me. I told him 6 words was more than most of them got. I had told Bracken to let the gun go. I think about that. That was the first lesson. The orcs were devastating in a straight fight, and a straight fight was all they understood. They did not do defense. They did not do vigilance. They did not do the grinding work of holding a position through the night so that the 30 seconds of something did not catch you flat. That was our job. The orcs broke the charges. We held the line. Venthan restructured the rotation so that guard pickets covered the flanks and approaches at night, while the orcs occupied the central fighting positions. The orcs did not picket. They did not patrol. What they did, and this was accidental rather than planned, was make so much noise at all hours that any enemy approaching the orc section was operating in what amounted to a constant low-grade sonic environment that made stealth essentially impossible. You cannot sneak up on something that is always banging on metal and bellowing at itself. The enemy tried twice. Both times, the approaching raiders were detected not by sentries or auspex or any technological means, but by an orc boy who happened to be awake because he was in the middle of modifying a weapon and who saw movement and shot at it, and the shooting woke the rest, and the rest poured out of the trench, and that was the end of the infiltration attempt. I said the orcs were transactional. This extended to their relationship with the enemy. On day 12, something happened that I did not fully understand at the time, and that I have been trying to understand ever since. During a standard daylight assault, a renegade marine, one of the big ones in full war plate with the brass trim and the skull fixtures, broke through the orc countercharge and reached the trench line. He landed in the orc section, on his feet, chain axe running, and he killed 2 boys before anyone could react. This was not unusual. The renegade marines were strong enough and fast enough to do this. What was unusual was what happened next. The marine found Dregmaw, or Dregmaw found the marine. They met in a section of trench that had been widened by orc occupation, and the marine swung his chain axe, and Dregmaw caught it. He caught it with his hand. The chain teeth chewed into his palm, and Dregmaw held on, and the marine tried to pull the weapon free and could not, because Dregmaw's grip is not a thing that releases on request. Then Dregmaw hit the marine with his other hand, which was holding the boarding axe, and the blow shattered the marine's chest plate and drove him into the trench wall, and Dregmaw hit him again and again, and the marine stopped moving. And Dregmaw stood there, bleeding from the hand with a dead renegade Astartes at his feet, and he looked at the body for a long time. Then he reached down and pulled the skull and brass icon from the marine's chest plate and hung it on his own belt. And he said something to Gutbrak that I could not hear, but that Gutbrak repeated to the other boys, and the other boys repeated to each other. And within the hour, every orc in the section was looking for brass and skull trophies. It was not worship. It was collection. The symbols meant nothing to them. What mattered was that the symbols came off things that were hard to kill, and wearing one meant you were the one who killed it. The enemy wore brass because they served something. The orcs wore the enemy's brass because they had beaten the things that served something. Day 13 was when Commissar Sorek came to inspect the orc section. Sorek was not a man who explained his schedule. He was tall, thin, precise in his movements, and his uniform was maintained to a standard that was almost aggressive in a combat environment. He had not fired his bolt pistol since we arrived, not for want of targets, but because the ones he was trained to identify, cowardice and desertion and failure of discipline, had been absent from the 19th. You need options before you can choose the wrong one, and we had none. Sorek walked the orc section for about 20 minutes. He observed the modifications the orcs had made to the trench system. He observed the weapons. He observed the trophies, which by this point included a significant amount of enemy material hung from the parapet, like laundry. He observed an orc boy urinating against the wall of what had been the command dugout. He observed Grotcholpa, the doc, performing surgery on an orc who appeared to be fully conscious and enthusiastically suggesting improvements. He observed all of this with an expression that I would describe as catastrophically neutral. Then he left. He did not say anything to me. He did not say anything to anyone. He filed his inspection report, and I never saw a copy. But I know, because Tessavain told me later, that the report's assessment section contained exactly 4 words: situation without imperial precedent. Nobody warned us about orc marksmanship, which exists only in theory. An orc does not aim. He points a weapon in the general direction of the enemy and pulls, with a margin of error that grows with distance and excitement, both permanently at maximum. We lost 4 soldiers to orc fire in the first 2 weeks. Friendly fire, except that the orcs were not our friends and the fire was not intentional. The correct term is probably accidental fire from co-belligerents, which has never appeared in any Imperial manual because the situation was never supposed to exist. Sorek found me after the second incident, the one that killed a trooper named Desavar because an orc boy fired at a retreating cultist and missed by about 40 degrees. He stood next to me on the fire step and looked at the orc section, and I expected discipline, procedure, the articles of war. He did not. He wanted 2 numbers: how many guardsmen the orcs had saved since day 1, and how many they had killed by accident. I gave him both. My estimate on the first was conservative. He did the arithmetic silently. Then he said, "The day those 2 numbers meet, I end this myself, and I will not require anyone's permission to do it. Until that day, my reports will say the situation is without Imperial precedent, and they will say nothing else." He looked at me to make sure I understood. I understood. The commissar had given the arrangement a ledger, and it was open, and as long as the orcs saved more of us than they killed, the books balanced. It frightened me more than any threat would have. He was not looking the other way. He was looking directly at it and keeping count. I asked him what ending it would look like, with 70 of them in the next section of our own trench, and 600 of us. It would not involve the orcs at all, he said. The arrangement had 1 signature on it, and he would only need to reach 1 man to withdraw it. Then he went back to his rounds. I did not repeat that to Venthin. I assumed he already knew, and from the way he ran the rest of the campaign, I still assume it. Some of them wanted no part of it. 4 that I know of tried to get word off Karsfeld. A corporal in 3rd Company drafted a statement and took it to the signals dugout on day 9, which achieved nothing. The regiment had 1 functioning Vox array. Its traffic went out through the same daily return Venthin signed, and the astropath attached to us at muster had died on the crossing and was never replaced. There was no independent channel. He could write anything he liked, and the only hand it would pass through belonged to the man he was writing about. He worked that out standing at the operator's shoulder, folded the statement into his coat, and went back to the line. And as far as I know, he carried it there for the rest of the campaign. Nobody punished him. Nobody needed to, except that there was one, and it landed a shuttle in our wire every 8 or 9 days. Dravek had a ship, holds going off-world with salvage in them, and no oath to anybody in that trench. A man who wanted his statement carried past Venthin's signature could have walked 40 meters and put it into her hand. Somebody did. She told me herself much later, without any particular discomfort. She took the paper. She read it. She told him she would see it went where it needed to go and did nothing with it at all. Her percentage was riding on the arrangement continuing, and 19 years of dealing with freebooter crews does not survive a filed account of a freebooter contract with an Imperial regiment. She was never neutral ground. She reads as an outsider here only because she was the one who spoke Gothic. Venthin addressed it on day 15 with what he called engagement lanes, separating guard arcs from orc arcs. This worked for about 6 hours. The orcs ignored them, not out of malice, but because a designated field of fire is incompatible with shooting at whatever is in front of you until it stops being there. He moved the guard positions further back instead, and the buffer took friendly fire from about 1 incident per engagement to 1 per 3, which was the best we were going to get, and which he recorded as an acceptable margin. By the 3rd week, the attacks were different, harder, not more frequent. On day 1, the Marines had been maybe 1 in 40 or 50, rare enough that you could go a full assault without seeing one. By day 20, they were 1 in 8. The enemy was committing its elite and pulling back the chaff. A cultist, however frenzied, is a human being with human limitations, and an orc handles those without difficulty. A renegade marine in full warplate is a different calculation. The orcs noticed too, and responded the way orcs respond to everything. They got excited. More marines meant harder fights. Harder fights meant better trophies. The orc section's trophy collection, which had started as a few pieces of scavenged armor plate hung from the parapet, had grown into something that looked like a shrine, except that the objects being venerated were not symbols of devotion, but evidence of violence. Brass icons, shattered helmet faceplates, broken chain axes, pieces of ceramite with bolt holes through them. Dregmar's belt was so heavy with trophies that it had required structural reinforcement, which Grizguts had provided by welding an additional chain to it that looped over the captain's shoulder, like a bandolier. The captain walked with a clanking sound that preceded him by about 5 seconds. I asked Dravek, the rogue trader, during one of her supply visits, whether this was normal. She took a percentage of the salvage. Every enemy vehicle the orcs dragged off the field and could not use, every ton of ceramite and plate the mech boy stripped and discarded, went out through her holds to a market she did not offer to describe to me. 19 years trading with freebooter crews across the subsector. That was why the answer had come back in a day. We had not found her. She had a standing relationship with people who needed a war, and we were a war that needed people. She looked at the trophy wall. She looked at me. Then, in a tone that suggested I was asking whether water was wet, she explained that freebooters were pirates and pirates collected trophies, and that the collection was simultaneously a record of achievement, a personal armory, a negotiating tool, and a recruitment advertisement. The more trophies Dregmar displayed, the more prestige he accumulated among orc society, and the more prestige he accumulated, the more likely it was that other orcs would hear about the good fighting on Karsfeld and come to join in. I asked her to repeat that last part. She repeated it. I asked if she was saying that our arrangement with one war band of freebooters could result in additional orcs arriving. It was not a question of could, she said. It was a question of when. That went up the chain the way everything did. I told Hulk. Hulk told Tessavine. Tessavine told Venthin. Venthin, according to Tessavine, closed his eyes for approximately 5 seconds, which was the longest expression of emotion I had ever heard, attributed to him, and then he said, "One problem at a time." The current problem was keeping 600 soldiers and 70 orcs alive against 4,000 enemy combatants. The future problem of additional orcs could be addressed when it became the current problem. This was not optimism. This was triage. Venthin was a man who understood that the luxury of worrying about the future belonged to people who were going to have one, and at our current rate of attrition, that was not a certainty. Day 22 was the day Venthin had calculated as our last of combat effectiveness. It was also the day the orcs decided to attack, not countercharge. Attack. Nobody had asked them to, and nobody had suggested it. The enemy did not attack on day 21. They had shifted to every other day assaults by then, interspersing the charges with night raids and what I recognized as probing actions designed to test our response times. The day without an assault made the orcs restless. The restlessness made them aggressive. The aggression needed a target. And on the morning of day 22, Dregmar stood up on the parapet, looked north toward the enemy positions in the hills, and said something to Gutbrak that Gutbrak repeated to the boys, and within 10 minutes the entire orc contingent was climbing out of the trench and forming up in the open ground in front of the wire, facing the enemy, with an air of purposeful anticipation that I had only previously associated with regimental parade formations, except that parades do not usually involve 70 heavily armed aliens revving chain weapons and roaring. Hulk found me. He said the orcs were attacking. I said I could see that. The colonel wanted to know whether we should support them. I said I did not think the colonel was going to get an answer to that question before the attack started, because the attack was starting now. And it was. The orcs went forward across the ground that had been the killing field for 6 weeks of enemy assaults. They went through the outer ring of enemy positions in about 40 minutes and reached the hill line in about an hour. And from the trench line I could hear the fighting, but I could not see it, because the orcs had gone over the crest and into the enemy's rear areas. The only evidence that they were still alive was the noise, which was considerable, and the occasional plume of smoke from something the mech boy had set on fire. Venthin made a decision. He pulled 2 platoons from the reserve and sent them forward to hold the ground the orcs had taken, so that if the orcs pushed the enemy back, the enemy would not simply flow around them and hit our undefended trench. This was the first time Guard and Ork forces operated in the same space, at the same time outside the trench line, and it was a catastrophe of coordination that somehow produced a result. The 2 platoons advanced to the outer enemy positions and found them empty. Not empty as in abandoned, empty as in cleared. The orcs had gone through these positions like a natural disaster, and the evidence of their passage was extensive, and I will not describe it in detail. The platoons dug in. They established a forward position. And when the orcs came back, 2 hours later, dragging loot and trophies and an actual enemy vehicle that 3 orcs were pushing uphill by hand because the engine was not working and they wanted Grizguts to look at it. They found a guard position waiting for them, with fields of fire covering their flanks. Dregmaw looked at the guard platoons and the positions they had established. He made the same sound he had made when Venthin shook his hand on day 1. Then he walked past them and back to the trench and sat down and began cleaning his axe with a rag made from an enemy's banner. That night, I lay on the fire step and listened to the orcs. Venthin's 22 days had assumed a defensive model: hold the line, take casualties, run out of soldiers. The orcs had taken ground. For the first time since we arrived, we were not surviving. We were winning. What that produced in me was not relief. An enemy that worshipped what this one worshipped did not lose quietly. They came back with more, and more was what I was afraid of. I was right to be afraid. On day 26, the enemy brought a dreadnought. I am using the Imperial term because I do not know what the enemy called it, and because the orcs had their own name for it, which translated approximately as Big Stompy Thing, which was technically accurate if not tactically useful. A Chaos Dreadnought. A walking sarcophagus of ancient ceramite and corrupted systems, 3 times the height of a man, with a power fist on one arm and a multi-melta on the other, and inside it something that had once been a space marine, and was now something that screamed constantly, a high, thin sound that carried across the battlefield like a signal. It came with the morning assault, and when it reached the countercharge line, the infantry parted to let it through, and it stepped into the middle of the orc formation and killed 3 boys in about 4 seconds. The power fist crushed one. The multi-melta vaporized another. The third was simply stepped on. It walked through the orc line the way a plow walks through soil, and for the first time since the arrangement began, I saw orcs give ground. Not retreat. Orcs do not retreat. But they moved, and the moving was involuntary, and the thing in the dreadnought kept screaming and kept killing, and for about 90 seconds I thought the arrangement was over. Then Dregmaw hit it with a chimera. Not a shell from a chimera. The chimera itself. Grizguts had fixed 2 of the 3 dead chimeras by this point, and one of them had been modified beyond any recognition of its original design, which is a polite way of saying the orcs had welded additional armor plate to it, mounted 2 extra weapons on the roof, painted it red with flames on the sides, and removed the driver's seat and replaced it with a standing platform, because orcs do not sit while driving. This chimera, at a speed no standard chimera reaches, because the orcs had done something to the engine that violated several physical laws, hit the dreadnought from the side at an angle no trained crew would have attempted, because a trained crew would know that ramming a dreadnought with a troop carrier is not a tactic. It is a gesture. The impact did not destroy it and did not significantly damage it. It knocked it off balance and stopped it for about 6 seconds, and in those 6 seconds Dregmaw reached it. He climbed the dreadnought the way you climb a wall, using his axe as a handhold, and found the joint between the sarcophagus and the torso assembly, and put the edge of the axe into it and hit the back of the axe with his metal jaw, using his own head as a hammer. The joint cracked. He hit it again. The thing inside screamed and tried to reach him and could not, because the arms did not articulate that way, and he hit it a 3rd time and the sarcophagus split open. What was inside is not something I will describe. Dregmaw looked at it for about 2 seconds, then put his axe through it, and the dreadnought stopped. The whole machine seized, locked, and went still, standing upright like a monument, and Dregmaw pulled his axe free and climbed down and walked back to the line, and the orcs who had been watching, who had all stopped fighting to watch, erupted in a sound that was not a cheer, because orcs do not cheer. It was acclaim. It was 70 voices declaring ownership of the moment, and the captain's name was in it, and the sound carried across the valley and up into the hills where the enemy was watching. After the dreadnought, things accelerated. 2 assaults a day, sometimes 3. The ratio of Marines to cultists was now nearly 1-4, and the orcs were thriving. They were bigger. I do not mean that as a figure of speech. Orcs grow when they fight. Gootbrak, who had been large when he arrived, was measurably larger by day 30. His shoulders were broader. His hands, which had been the size of dinner plates, were now the size of serving platters. The boys were growing too, at a rate that made no biological sense and was happening anyway. Dregmaw's voice had deepened and his jaw had been reinforced twice by Grizguts to keep pace with the skull growing around it. We fought to survive. They fought to become more, and merchant shipping does not fight back the way brass-clad berserkers fight back. Day 30 was when Dravek's prediction came true. A ship entered orbit, an Ork cruiser, which is what they call something between a frigate and a cruiser, assembled out of the wreckage of other ships. It did not hail us. It did not hail anyone. Nothing challenged it because there was nothing in the system to challenge it with. Whatever escort had brought the invasion force to Karsfeld had gone on to whatever the Navy considered the actual war, and had been gone since before the 16th came off the line. A civilized world with no orbital presence is not unusual in a war zone. It becomes remarkable when you are standing on it, watching somebody else's ship take station overhead at their convenience. Within 6 hours, a shuttle, or something serving the function of a shuttle the way a thrown brick serves the function of a projectile, landed 3 kilometers east, and 38 additional orcs walked out of it and presented themselves to Dregmaw as if they had been invited. They had not been invited. They had heard. There are no orc astropaths and no relays, and there is still some mechanism by which orcs know where good fighting is happening, and they come. Dregmaw took them in. Of course he did. More boys meant more fighting, and more fighting was always better. Venthan was informed. Venthan closed his eyes for 5 seconds. Then he opened them and said, Give them guns. We gave them guns. We had plenty. By day 32, we had over 100 orcs. By day 35, 130. They came in 5s and 10s, landing in whatever passed for transport, and walking to the line with an unerring sense of where the fighting was, from different ships and different war bands and parts of a sector I had never mapped. Some were freebooters like Dregmaw's crew, in the flashy coats and earrings and personalized weapons that marked them as pirates. Others were just boys, without a war band or a ship or anything except a weapon and a desire to be where the noise was. Dregmaw took them all. He did not turn anyone away. In Orc society, a captain's prestige is measured in 2 currencies: the quality of his fights and the number of his boys. Both were increasing daily, and Dregmaw's status was climbing at a rate that was visible in the way the newcomers approached him, with a deference that was alien to see in creatures who resolved most social disputes by headbutting. He was becoming a war boss, not by declaration, not by ambition as far as I could tell, by gravity. The fight on Karsfeld was pulling orcs toward it, and Dregmaw was at the center, and the mass was accumulating. Every day I reported the numbers: 612 guardsmen, 131 orcs, then 140, then 150. The numbers went up the chain to Venthin, and Venthin passed them to Sorek, and Sorek added them to his inspection reports, and the reports went into the communications buffer, and presumably off-world, though we had received no acknowledgement of any report filed since the orcs arrived, which was either a communications failure or a deliberate silence, and I did not want to know which because both answers were bad in different ways. On day 33, the enemy changed its approach again. We were in a fight, a big one. The enemy had committed what felt like everything, a full-strength assault with marine elements on all axes, and the orcs had countercharged as usual, and the Guard was providing fire support as usual, but this time the enemy had anticipated the pattern and had held a reserve force, several hundred cultists and a dozen marines, in the rubble of an old processing plant a kilometer east of the line. And they hit the Guard section from the flank, while the orcs were engaged to the north, and there was nobody in between. They came through the wall of an old warehouse that bordered our communication trench, and they were among us before anyone could react, and the fighting was in the trench at close range, in the worst possible conditions for a lass-armed infantry unit against power-armored assault troops. I was in the communication trench when the first one came through. He was huge, red-armored, brass-trimmed, and his chain axe was already running, and I fired my last gun at his chest, and the beam dissipated across his breastplate, and he barely acknowledged it. He killed the man next to me, Trooper Orlik, by cutting him from shoulder to hip with one stroke, and he was turning to kill me when Hulk hit him with a crack grenade at a range of about 4 meters, which was close enough to kill us both if the grenade had detonated on our side. But it did not. It detonated against the Marine's pauldron and blew his arm off, and he kept coming, one-armed, and Hulk shot him in the neck joint with a las pistol, and the beam went through and the Marine fell. There were more behind him. There were always more behind him. They poured through the breach and into the trench, and we fought them with everything we had, which was not enough, and they were pushing us back toward the main line when Gutbrak arrived. Not from the Orc section. From the north, from the open ground where the countercharge was happening, alone. And I do not know how he knew, because nobody had sent word and the Vox was down and the noise of combat was general and omnidirectional. But he came. He came through the breach in the warehouse wall behind the enemy, and he hit the rearmost Marine in the back with his cleaver, and the Marine went down, and Gutbrak stepped on him and hit the next one and the next one, and he was in the trench now, filling it completely with his mass, and the enemy Marines were caught between our fire from one end and Gutbrak's cleaver from the other, and for about 90 seconds the communication trench was a place of such concentrated violence that I cannot separate the individual events. Bodies fell, blades connected. Gutbrack bled from a dozen wounds and kept swinging. Hulk and I and 3 other guardsmen fired until our power cells were empty, and then we fixed bayonets and fought from behind Gutbrack, like men sheltering behind a moving wall. When it was over, Gutbrack was standing in a trench full of dead renegade Marines, breathing hard, which was the first time I had seen an orc show exertion. He looked at Hulk and me and the 3 troopers still alive. Then he pointed at me and said something Dravek later translated as, "You still owe me guns, little one." He walked back toward the orc section, stepping over the dead, trailing blood, and did not look back. He had not come to save us. He had come because there were enemies to kill and we happened to be where the enemies were. My squad was alive because an orc knob had walked through a flanking assault of renegade Astartes, and I owed him guns. The orcs did not become our friends, but Gutbrack came through that breach, and Dregmaw killed the dreadnought, and Grisgots fixed a guardsman's broken Voxcaster by hitting it once with his wrench and walked away without comment. That was not friendship, it was investment. The orcs protected what was useful to them, and we were useful, and that was enough. Not all of the new arrivals were pleased with the arrangement. There was a knob among them, a heavy one with a bare skull and a red painted jaw, who I traded with twice. His argument was not that we were a disgrace. Orcs do not have that argument. His argument was that a warband taking guns off Humies has decided it cannot get guns for itself, and that a captain who lets a fight be brought to him by little pink things with paper has stopped being the biggest thing on the field. He made it in front of 40 boys on his 4th day on the line. Dregmaw killed him for it on the spot with the boarding axe and went on with what he had been doing. I noticed on my next run because the trades were being taken by somebody else and nobody could be bothered to explain why. He had not been killed for being wrong about us. He had been killed for saying the captain was small, at volume, where it could be heard. On day 36, he came and asked for more. He came down out of the hills with Gutbrack and about 40 boys behind him, which was not a threat, and was not a threat. And he stood at the boundary line and put it to Venthin, through Dravek in 4 sentences. And Dravek gave them to us in his order and his register. He had more boys. More boys needed more guns. We had been 640 and we were less than that now, and he had worked out the difference the way you work out anything you are about to be given. He wanted the heavy weapons, not the surplus Las guns, the Lasannons, the autocannons, the crew-served platforms in the storage alcoves that we had never had the men to fire. Venthin said no. I was close enough to hear the pause afterwards, and it was the longest 4 seconds of the campaign. Then Dregmaw made a sound that was not the approval grunt and was not a laugh, and said through Dravek that the fighting had been good, and he would take that instead for now. And they went back up the hill. Venthin had shaken that hand at the wire on the first morning, and had not flinched when the bones went. A captain does not take from a thing that does not give way. He had asked. That was the change. Up to day 36, we had been paying him. After day 36, we were being allowed to keep things. Venthin started signing everything the next morning. I noticed first because I carried the chits. Every transfer out of the weapons store had until then gone over whichever officer happened to be standing in the alcove, usually Tessavine and twice me. From day 37, it was Venthin's name on every one, including the ones written up after the fact, and walked to him at midnight. He signed the daily returns when a captain could have done it. He signed the ammunition drawdowns. He signed a slip for 2 crates of power cells I could have initialed with my thumb. Sorek had said he would only need to reach one man. Venthan had heard the same sentence from the same mouth and had spent every morning since making certain it was true. He was not covering himself. It was the opposite, in writing, in his own hand, at 30 or 40 signatures a day, so that when somebody finally came to Karsfeld with a list, there would be exactly one name on all of it, and no room on the page for a second. I brought Tessavine a transfer chit that had come back signed and asked her why the colonel was doing a captain's work. She looked at it for a while. Then she said she was the one who had spoken the word orcs out loud in a room with 8 people in it. Venthan had asked a question carefully enough that it could have died there. She had answered it. 6 weeks of running a company and counting greenskins since, with her name on none of the paper that mattered. He had not discussed the signing with her. He had simply started the morning after the captain came down the hill, and she had noticed on the second day and said nothing and did not intend to. Then she gave me the chit back and told me to get the carbines up the line. Day 37 was when the offensive began. Ours only in the sense that we participated. It was not planned by Venthan and followed no doctrine in any manual I had been issued. Dregmaw had got bored with countercharging. The enemy had pulled back to its main positions in the hills after the dreadnought was killed, and the assaults on the line had dropped to one a day, sometimes one every 2 days, and Dregmaw was restless, and a restless orc captain with 150 boys is not a thing you contain. He decided to go get them, he told Gutbrack. Gutbrack told the boys. The boys picked up their weapons, and 150 orcs walked north, through the outer positions they had already cleared in the earlier raids, into the hills toward the enemy's main stronghold. Venthan sent 3 platoons to follow, not to fight alongside, but to hold ground and prevent the enemy from cutting behind the orc advance. I was in one of those platoons. Hulk led us. We followed the orcs into the hills and into the war that the orcs had decided was happening, whether we agreed or not. The enemy's main position was an old quarry complex about 7 kilometers north of the Haldren line, and it was a natural fortress. High walls of cut stone, a single road in, open ground on 3 sides, earthworks and bunkers, and something at the center I could see from a distance and could not identify. It was tall, made of metal and bone, and decorated with the brass and skull motif that covered everything the enemy made. That quarry was where they had launched from for 6 weeks, and where they went between attacks, and as far as our intelligence could determine, it was the command center and the devotional heart of the enemy force on Karsfeld. Venthan had looked at it on his tactical display and calculated that taking it by assault with infantry would require a force 3 times our combined strength and air support that we did not have. The orcs did not do this calculation. The orcs saw a big enemy camp and went toward it. What followed was 2 days of the most sustained fighting I experienced on Karsfeld. The orcs hit the outer earthworks on the morning of day 37 and pushed through the first defensive line by afternoon. The enemy fought back with everything: Marines, cultists, war machines, and things that I did not recognize and do not want to name. The orcs took casualties, real casualties. Orcs were dying faster than Grochoppa could patch them up, which had not happened once since day 1. His surgical output had reached a rate that would have required a full field hospital in any Imperial formation, and he managed it with his hacksaw, his bag, and a level of enthusiasm that was itself medically concerning. I watched an orc boy die, properly die. A Marine put a power sword through his chest, and the orc grabbed the blade with both hands and pulled the Marine closer and bit his face off through his helmet visor, and then fell and did not get up. The Marine did not get up either. The exchange rate was brutal, but it was not equal, because orcs are harder to kill, and there were more of them, and the orc advance continued. We were supposed to hold the cleared ground behind them. That lasted until the middle of the first afternoon, when the orcs went through the second earthwork faster than anybody had allowed for, and the enemy came back into the ground behind them, which was the ground we were standing on, and there stopped being a behind. After that, we were inside it with them, and I can tell you exactly what fighting alongside orcs is, because up to that point I had only watched it. You cannot hold a formation, not because they break it, but because they do not see it. A boy came through my section at a run with a cultist under one arm and went between Hulk and me without altering his line by a foot, and the correct response, which I learned in about a second, is to get out of the way and reform afterwards. You cannot fire past them. Their shooting comes from behind you at the same time and at roughly the same standard. And twice that afternoon I went flat because of a noise behind me rather than in front. You cannot take an objective because they take it first, and they do not tell you they have taken it. So you go through a bunker door braced for a fight and find 4 dead cultists and a boy sitting on the ammunition looking at you with mild interest. And you cannot be wounded quietly. Grauchopa had come up with the assault and worked where the fighting stopped, and when a trooper called Ren went down with his forearm opened, the doc reached him before our own orderly did and had a grip on the arm before anybody could explain that Ren was not one of his. What he did to it was fast and filthy, and Ren kept the arm, and the orderly, who had trained 8 years for that job, stood there holding a clean dressing and said nothing at all. There was one thing they did that I have never been able to file. In the second hour, a boy killed a Marine 3 meters from my position, took the Marine's bolt pistol, looked at it, decided it was not to his taste, and put it in my hands. Then he went back into the fight. It was not a gift, and I do not think he considered it one. It was a thing that was no use to him, and I was standing there. I carried it for the rest of the campaign. It was taken off me at the end of it by somebody entitled to take it, and I handed it over without a word because a bolt pistol lifted off a dead renegade is obviously a weapon and obviously not mine. What I was left holding was the thing that looked like scrap. Most of our casualties came anyway, because being inside an orc assault does not make a Marine any less able to kill line infantry. I lost 2 men on day 37 and 3 on day 38, and each one hurt in the way that losses hurt when you are 600 and shrinking. Hulk was wounded on the second day, a piece of shrapnel that took a chunk out of his left arm, and he wrapped it with a field dressing and kept fighting because there was nobody to replace him, and because Hulk did not believe in stopping for anything short of decapitation. On the evening of day 38, the orcs reached the center of the quarry. I had moved up with Hulk's squad to a position on the quarry rim by then, close enough to see it, close enough to wish I had not. The enemy had concentrated its remaining strength around the structure in the center, the tall thing of metal and bone that I could now see clearly, and that was an altar, or a trophy rack, or a signal, or all 3 at once, made from the armor and the bones of everything the warband had killed since it arrived on Karsfeld, and a long time before that. The orcs did not laugh during this phase. They fought in silence, the first and only time I heard it, and the silence was worse than the noise because it meant the fighting had stopped being entertainment and become work. The quarry floor was a killing ground. Orcs and renegade Marines were fighting at ranges so close that ranged weapons were useless, and every engagement was blade against blade, fist against fist, mass against mass. I saw a Marine cut an orc nearly in half with a chain axe, and the orc, with his torso held together by nothing I could identify, reached up and broke the Marine's neck with both hands before he fell. I saw 3 boys mob a Marine in armor heavier than anything I had a name for, and bring it down through sheer combined weight, piling on top of it like hounds on a bear, and the sound of the armor cracking was audible from the rim. Dregmaw was in the middle of it. I could see him through the magnifier, his silhouette unmistakable. Twice the size he had been on day 1. The metal jaw catching the light from fires that burned along the quarry walls. He was fighting toward the altar and toward the figure standing in front of it, and I knew who the figure was before I could see the details because I had heard the description from the prisoners in the first week. The horned helm, the reforged weapons of dead champions mounted on the faceplate, the cape made from something that had once been skin. He was enormous, even by Astarte's standards, and he moved with a speed that should not have been possible in that much armor, and he was killing everything that came near him, orc after orc, with a 2-handed axe that trailed a haze in the air behind it. Dregmaw reached him. The captain hit him with the boarding axe, and the warlord caught the blow on the haft of his own weapon, and the impact knocked both of them sideways. And then they were fighting, properly fighting, and the combat between them lasted about 4 minutes, and I could not follow all of it because of the speed and the smoke, and because at several points they were obscured by other fighters who stumbled into their orbit and were killed by either or both of them, without either breaking from the engagement. Then Dregmaw lost his axe. The warlord struck it from his grip, and the weapon spun away across the quarry floor, and Dregmaw was unarmed, and the warlord swung the 2-handed axe at his head, and Dregmaw caught it. He caught the haft with one hand and the blade with the other, and the blade bit into his palm, and he held on, the same way he had held the chain axe on day 12. And the warlord tried to pull free and could not, and Dregmaw pulled back, and the warlord came with the weapon, off balance, and Dregmaw hit him with his metal jaw. Not a headbutt. A bite. The augmetic closed on the warlord's gorget, the throat armor, and the plate that Grisgoots had reinforced twice for the captain's growing skull bit through ceramite, and the warlord dropped. Dregmaw ripped the horned helm from the body and held it up, and the orcs found their voices again, and the sound that came out of the quarry was the loudest thing I had heard on Karsfeld, louder than the dreadnought, louder than anything I had heard in 12 years of service. It was a name. It was Dregmaw's name, roared by 150 orc voices, and it echoed off the quarry walls and rolled down the hillside and reached the Haldren line, where the rest of the guard was listening, and Venthin was standing in the command dugout, hearing the sound, and he knew what it meant. The enemy stronghold had fallen. The assault was over. The orcs had won. They did not come back. Not that night. Not the next day. We held our positions in the forward trench line and waited for the orcs to return to the Haldren line, the way they had after every previous engagement, dragging loot and trophies and demanding food and ammunition. They did not come. Gutbrak did not come. Dregmaw did not come. The orc section of the trench line, 400 meters of modified, painted, deeply damaged fortification that smelled like a fungal granary and sounded like an engine factory, was empty. The orcs had stayed in the quarry. They had taken the enemy's position and they had kept it. And they were there now in the hills, 7 kilometers from the line, and we could hear them at night. Faintly, a distant industrial noise carried on the wind, and we did not know what they were doing. Dravek knew. She arrived on day 40 with her shuttle and her translator and her ability to walk into situations that would paralyze anyone else with self-preservation instincts. She went up to the quarry. She came back the same evening. I was not in the room for what followed either. Tessavine told me afterward, and I will tell it the way she told it to me, which was factual and without commentary. Her report to Venthin was the thing that broke it all, not because the deal had failed, but because it had succeeded in a way that nobody had anticipated, and that nobody could control. The Orks had taken the quarry. They had killed or driven off the enemy force. The warband, what was left of it, had scattered into the surrounding hills and was no longer a cohesive military force. The threat to the Haldren line was, for practical purposes, over. The city of Branhurst was no longer in immediate danger. The Thesmar 19th had survived. The arrangement had worked. That was the good news. The bad news was everything else. The Orks had not taken the quarry to hold it for us. They had taken it because they wanted it. Dregmar had established himself in the enemy's former command post. Grisgoots was building something in the quarry pit that Dravek described as a workshop, though the word did not begin to cover the scale. The Orks had begun fortifying the quarry, not in an Imperial fashion, but in an Ork fashion, which meant walls made of scrap metal, gun emplacements made of enemy vehicles, and a general atmosphere of violent industrialization that Dravek said was the early stage of an Ork settlement. A settlement. The Orks were not leaving. They were settling. They were turning the quarry into a base, a permanent presence, and the trickle of incoming Orks that had brought the warband from 70 to 150 was not going to stop, because the fighting on Karsfeld was now famous, in whatever way Orks measure fame, and more were coming. Branhurst sat 7 kilometers from the quarry with 300,000 people in it, and a garrison that had been combat ineffective since before we landed. Nothing stood between the two except open ground and 600 men who were not going to fight anybody. I put it to Dravek on her next visit. The city was not being spared, she said. It was being postponed. Orks go where the fighting is, and while there was a war band scattered in the hills to hunt down, there was better use for an afternoon than a city that could not shoot back. The danger was not the Orks getting hungry. The danger was the Orks getting bored. 150 greenskins would take Branhurst apart over a season for want of anything else to do, and the only reason it had not started was that we had, without meaning to, given them a better offer. The 16th knew. 400 and something men were holding the Branhurst perimeter because they were too broken to hold anything else, and they were now the nearest armed Imperial force to an Ork settlement. Provincial regiments are raised on the world they defend. Every man in it had a family behind that wire. Their colonel came out to the Haldren line on the 2nd of the quiet days. And I was not in the dugout for it, but Tessavine was. And she told me afterwards that he did not raise his voice once and did not ask a single question about how the arrangement had come about. He asked one thing several times in several forms. He wanted to know what the Thesmar 19th intended to do when it started. Venthin told him the truth, which was that 600 men would not be able to do anything about it, and the colonel of the 16th said that he had 400 and something and already knew that, and that he had come to hear somebody else say it out loud. Then he went back to his city. He had not come for reassurance. He had come for confirmation, so that he could stop hoping. Venthin heard this. His eyes went to the tactical display, then the trench map, then south, toward the city of Branhurst behind us. He said, "How many more?" Dravek did not know. It depended on how widely the reputation had spread, and how many freebooter captains in the surrounding sectors considered the fighting worth the trip. And she could not predict that, because Ork decision-making was not something that lent itself to prediction. It could be dozens. It could be hundreds. And then she paused and said that if enough came and the fighting continued, and Dregmar went on growing in stature and strength, what was happening in the quarry could become the nucleus of something larger. Venthin asked what she meant by larger. She said the word that every human in the room knew, but nobody had spoken since the arrangement began. She said, "Wah!" Sorek had been in the room the whole time, standing by the door, and had not spoken. When Dravek said the word, he did not react visibly. His gaze passed from Venthen to Dravek to the floor. Then he said, very quietly and very precisely, that the situation now presented the Thesmar 19th with two possible outcomes. The first was that the regiment reported the full scope of the arrangement to Sector Command, including the Xenos Alliance, the settlement, and the risk of a nascent greenskin migration, and accepted whatever consequences followed. The second was that the regiment dealt with the situation itself immediately before it grew beyond the capacity of 600 soldiers to influence it. He did not elaborate on what dealing with the situation would mean. He did not need to. He was proposing that the Thesmar 19th attack the Orks, our allies. The creatures who had saved us, sitting in a quarry 7 kilometers away with our weapons, our ammunition, and a collection of trophies taken off enemies they had killed on our behalf. Venthen was silent for a long time. Then he said something that Tessavine told me about later, with the expression of someone who has heard something so quietly devastating that repeating it feels like a violation. What the colonel said was, "We hired them and they delivered. They are sitting in that quarry with our weapons, our ammunition, and a knowledge of our positions, our strength, and our supply situation that no enemy on this planet possesses. If we fire on them now, 300 orcs who know where we sleep will come through the Haldren line before dawn, and this regiment dies for the second time in 6 weeks." The numbers did not work, he said. The Thesmar 19th would not start a fight. It could not win. Sorek looked at him. He nodded. He would file a separate report recommending clemency for the regiment's commander, on the grounds that the decision to engage Xenos mercenaries was taken under duress with no alternative available, and that the tactical outcome had preserved an Imperial position otherwise lost. Then the rest of it, which was not for Venthen's benefit. A commissar who has only ever recorded condemnations is a commissar whose condemnations get skimmed. The value of the file is that it is sometimes the other thing. It would probably not matter, he said, and he would file it anyway. Then he left. The next 3 days were quiet. Quiet in the way that the space between the last shot and the first consequence is quiet. We held the Haldren line. The Orks held the quarry. Except that they did not hold it quietly. The terms had been that if the fighting stopped being good, the Orks would leave and take everything they could carry. The fighting had stopped. By the letter of what we had agreed, we should have woken on the 3rd morning to an empty quarry and an empty weapons store. We did not, and the reason was audible from 7 kilometers if you stood on the parapet after dark. They were fighting each other. 300 orcs in a hole with no enemy do not become peaceful. They become their own supply. Grizguts built, and somebody wrecked what he built, and somebody was killed for wrecking it, and Dregmaw came down on all of them, and that was a night. Then it happened again. A captain holds his position by being the largest thing in the quarry, and every boy who arrives is a boy who has not yet tested that, and there is no season in which this concludes. So the contract held. They had found a way to keep the fighting good without us, on ground they had taken, at a rate that will not run out. The only thing that had ever kept them moving was the absence of a reason to stop. We gave them one. The enemy was scattered. No assaults came, no night raids. The war, or this piece of it, was over. And in the silence I walked the trench. I walked past the orc section, still empty, still smelling of them, still painted with their crude faces and decorated with their trophies. I walked past the weapons storage alcoves, which were almost empty now. We had given the orcs everything. Every surplus LAS gun, every autocannon, every missile launcher, every piece of equipment left behind by the dead regiments that had held the line before us. We had paid the full price, and it had delivered what it promised. The fighting was good. The fighting was over. And the orcs were still here. On day 43, two things arrived at Karsfeld. The first was a Munitorum convoy, 6 months late, carrying the reinforcements and heavy equipment that the Thesmar 19th had requested when we were 3,000 strong and dying. 2,000 fresh troops, armor, artillery, a medici detachment, a Ministorum confessor, and an administratum liaison with instructions to conduct a theater review. The reinforcements that would have saved us. They came 6 months too late, and they came to a battlefield that no longer needed them, because the battlefield had been won by something the Imperium did not authorize and did not want to acknowledge. The second thing that arrived was another orc ship, bigger than the first. It settled into a low orbit and began dropping shuttles, and the shuttles carried orcs, dozens of them, and the orcs walked to the quarry and joined Dregmaw, and by nightfall the quarry's population had doubled. Venthin's report went out that evening. Sorix went with it. The administratum liaison, who had arrived expecting to review a struggling garrison, and found instead a 600-man regiment cohabiting a war zone with over 300 orcs, did not file a report. He needed to consult his superiors. The situation was beyond his remit. He said several other things that meant the same thing, which was that nobody wanted their name on the document that described what had happened on Karsfeld, because the document would either end in a commendation for unconventional brilliance or a mass execution order for Xenos collaboration, and nobody could predict which. The confessor was not so undecided. He had come off the convoy with the Medici detachment, a thin man named Ferrant, with a shaved skull and the field kit of somebody who had done this before, and he was on the line inside 2 hours of landing. He walked the empty orc section and looked at the trophy wall for a long time and did not touch it. Then he found Venthan and asked him, in front of whoever was standing there, whether he had knowingly delivered Imperial munitions into Xenos' hands. Venthan said yes and did not qualify it. Ferrant did not shout. He wrote for 2 days in a requisition dugout with a lamp and a folding desk, and on the 3rd day he went back to the starport and put his account into the Ministorum's own channel, which does not pass through the regimental vox and does not carry the colonel's signature. There was a route off Karsfeld the whole time. It belonged to a body that had not yet arrived. Armor brings its own people, and it cost us the only 2 working vehicles the regiment had, and my last gun with them. Imperial tanks do not travel without the machine cult attending them, and 2 engineers came off the convoy with the Lehman Russ squadron and were walking the motor pool by the 2nd afternoon. They found the chimeras. Nobody accused anybody of anything, and nobody raised a voice. The senior of the 2 spent 40 minutes with the first hull, did not touch the second at all after he opened the engine deck and looked in, then wrote a finding, had it countersigned, and hung a seal on both. The finding did not mention orcs. It said the machine spirits had been roused by unsanctioned means and could not be certified. 2 vehicles that had been carrying men and killing things for 6 weeks stopped being vehicles at the moment. Somebody with the standing to say so looked at them. They were still sitting there working. The Mechanicus has no form for a thing a mech boy has hit into working, so it used the one it had. Then the finding went into the file alongside everything else, on top of the requisition with Venthin's name on it that had put a mech boy in a guard motor pool in the first place. On the morning of day 44, which was the first day after the arrangement, I was up on the parapet looking north. The hills were quiet. A faint haze of smoke rose from the quarry where the orcs were building and banging and doing whatever orcs do when they are not fighting, which, based on my experience, was preparing to fight. Behind me, in the city, the reinforcements were unloading. Fresh troops, clean uniforms, full-power cells. They looked at us the way people look at something they have heard stories about and are not sure they believe. We looked back the way the Karsfeld 16th had looked at us when we arrived, which is to say with the expression of people who know something that the newcomers will learn and that the learning will cost them. Their officers reacted the way you would expect, and it changed nothing. They were not a formation. They were replacements, drafted against the 19th's establishment strength. So at the moment the convoy master signed them across, every one of them was on the roll of a regiment that had spent 6 weeks fighting beside Xenos. Nobody asked them. A major came down that afternoon and told Venthen he intended to record his objection in writing, and Venthen gave him a clerk and a table. The objection went into the regimental file. The regimental file goes out under the colonel's signature. Hulk stood next to me. His arm was wrapped. He had refused the Medikey attention because the new Medikey staff asked questions he did not want to answer. Questions about the Ork section, and the modified chimeras, and the trophy wall, and the spent power cells from weapons that were not in our regimental inventory. He stood and looked north. I stood and looked north. Then he said the only thing I ever heard him say about any of it. 11 years soldiering, 2 uniforms, 4 worlds, and not once had anybody asked whether he agreed with the reason. He said it to the hills, not to me. I did not answer. That is the whole of what Hulk had to say about 43 days, and I have set it down because he is not going to. The sound of the quarry carried on the wind, faint and rhythmic, metal on metal, voices that were not human, the sound of something growing. I told Hulk I owed Gutbrack 4 Lascarbines. He looked at me. He looked at the hills. He said I should probably deliver them before the situation changed. So I picked up the 4 Lascarbines. I climbed out of the trench. I got about 60 meters before the major from the convoy came out of the communication trench behind me and told me to stop, which was a lawful order from an officer whose name I did not know. And I stopped because I am a corporal and that is what happens. He wanted to know what I was carrying and where I was taking it, and I told him both without dressing either up. He had been on the planet for a day, and he had already written 1 objection into the regimental file the previous afternoon, and he was, I think, genuinely at the end of what he could hold, and he told me to put the weapons on the ground and consider myself under arrest. Then Venthen came up the communication trench. I did not see anybody send for him, and I have never known whether somebody did. He listened to the major say it again. Then he took the chit out of his coat, the one with his own signature on it, issued the previous evening for 4 Lascarbines to be transferred out of regimental stores at the discretion of the bearer, and he handed it to the major and told him that the corporal was executing a written order, and that if the major wished to countermand it, he was welcome to add his name underneath. The major looked at the paper for a long moment, then he gave it back and walked away without saying anything else, and I picked the weapons up again, and Venthen went back down the trench, and that was the last time I spoke to him. Then I walked north, across the open ground that had been a killing field for 6 weeks, past the craters and the wire and the wreckage, toward the hills and the quarry and the sound of orcs. I had guns to deliver and a debt to honor, and the fact that the debt was owed to something that should have been my enemy, and that honoring it would probably be listed in whatever report finally landed on whatever desk finally decided our fate was not something I had time to think about. I had been thinking for 43 days, and thinking had never been the thing that kept me alive. What kept me alive was the arrangement, and it was simple. You bring guns, you get to live. I had guns. I was bringing them. The walk to the quarry took about 90 minutes. The sound got louder as I got closer, and by the time I reached the outer earthworks, I could feel it in my chest, a deep industrial rhythm that was partly mechanical and partly organic, and entirely orc. The quarry was unrecognizable. What had been the enemy's stronghold was now an orc camp, a sprawling construction of scrap metal and vehicle parts and salvaged material that looked like it had been assembled by a fever dream with access to a welding torch. Gutbrak was at the gate, which was a piece of enemy armor plate leaning against two posts. He saw me. He saw the Lascarbines, the grunt. I handed them over. He inspected them. He made a face about their size, which was ritual. Then he reached behind him and produced a piece of metal and handed it to me. It was a piece of Dregmaw's trophy collection, a section of the horned helm from the enemy warlord, brass and dark steel, the size of my palm. I took it. As a transaction, it meant everything. I was paid. The debt was clear. About 400 meters back down the hill, I understood what was in my hand. It was not a souvenir. It was a piece of the war gear of a champion of the thing our confessors are not permitted to name, cut off his head by an orc and given to a guardsman as payment, and I was carrying it toward a dugout where an official of the administratum was waiting to take my account. I have seen a man shot for less. So I turned around and started back up, and got perhaps 30 meters before I stopped. There is only one rule in the arrangement, and I had spent 43 days keeping it. You give something, you get something. Handing it back was refusing payment, in front of his boys, at the gate of his own camp, with 4 Lascarbines of mine already inside it. I stood on that hillside a while, and then I put it in my coat and walked down. I could have dropped it in a crater. A man who hides one thing has hidden everything, and every question that comes afterwards is asked of a liar. 90 minutes back across the killing field. When I reached the trench, Hulk was still standing on the fire step. He asked me if it was done. I said it was done. He nodded. Then he said the new administratum liaison wanted to speak with me about the orc section, and what was I going to tell him? The brass was in my coat where I had put it, and I could feel the weight of it against my ribs the whole way down the trench. I looked at the hills. I could hear them up there, clanking and roaring and building and growing, and I thought that whatever I told the liaison, whatever Venthan told Sector Command, whatever Sorek wrote in his reports, none of it would change what was coming. I did not yet know about the pouch. Ferrand was still in his dugout with his lamp that morning, and had another day of writing in front of him, and I would not learn where his account had gone until after it was gone. The orcs were on Karsfeld. They were not leaving. And the Imperium, when it finally turned its attention to this world, would find something that no procedure covered and no manual explained. A regiment that had survived by breaking every rule it had been given. Allies that had won by ignoring every principle of war except the one that mattered. And a quarry full of growing, laughing, building, fighting greenskins who had been invited and who considered the invitation permanent. I told Hulk I was going to tell the liaison the truth. All of it. He looked at me with his one expression. He said that ought to be interesting. Somewhere in the hills, Dregmaw roared. The sound crossed the valley and hit the trench line, and the new troops, the reinforcements in their clean uniforms, looked up with wide eyes because they had never heard anything like it and did not know what it meant. I knew what it meant. It meant the fighting was good. It meant there would be more. Behind me, 300,000 civilians in Branhurst went on living. They did not know who had saved them. They did not know what the saving had cost, or that what they had been given was not a rescue but a delay, and that the length of it depends on how long the hills stay interesting. 7 kilometers north, in a quarry that used to belong to the enemy and now belonged to something worse, an Ork mech boy was building a workshop, and an Ork captain was growing into a war boss, and more Orks were coming, and the weapons we paid them with were being welded into things that no manual could identify. Sarek's ledger still balanced. The Orks had saved more of us than they had killed. The books were open, and the entries were legible, and the administratum liaison was sitting in the command dugout with his stylus, waiting for me to come and dictate something he could file. So that is what I am doing. That is what this is. 43 days. I am giving you all of them. Write it down, file it, send it up the chain, and understand that yours is the second account off this world, and the first one did not have a guardsman's side in it at all. That is the only reason I am talking. Somebody is going to decide what to do about the 300 Orks in the hills, and the 300 after that, and however many come after those, and about 600 men and 2,000 more who never got asked. It will not be me. I am a corporal. I deliver lascarbines, and I hold a trench. There is one more thing, and you are not going to like it. It was given to me on the last day of it by an Ork as payment in front of witnesses, and I have carried it down a hill and across a killing field and into this dugout, rather than drop it in a hole where nobody would ever have known. It goes here on the table with the rest of it. Write that down too.